Hey there, and welcome to this course on CSS variables. So, why do you want to learn CSS variables? Well, first of all, because in CSS, you very often end up in situations like this, where you have, for example, a main red color throughout your app, which you are using at multiple places. And the old way of doing that would simply be to reuse the same hexadecimal value, like that. However, with CSS variables, you're able to declare it as a variable first, and then use that variable wherever you want later on. And the obvious benefit here is that now you can simply update this value here, and these two will be automatically updated. And also, semantically, it makes more sense. It's easier to see that, yeah, this title is red than it is to see that this title here is red, unless you can parse hexadecimal values quickly in your head. And some of you might say that, well, I've had less and Sass variables for years. So what's new with CSS variables? Well, first of all, it's easier to get started. This is native to the browser, so you need no transpiling, which is pretty nice. Secondly, CSS variables have access to the DOM, so you can create local scopes, meaning CSS variables that only work in a certain section of your app, for example. You can also change the variables with JavaScript, which is really handy. For example, if you want to enable your users to, let's say, change the font size of your page. And it's also ideal for responsiveness, as you can change variables, for example, based upon media queries. And neither of these use cases, which I'll show you later, would be possible with less and Sass. And finally, as we'll see, it's perfect for themes. And by that, I don't necessarily mean themes as in your website visitors being able to change the layout, but component-specific themes. For example, for items which you want to change a little bit. Could be a product after it has been added to a shopping cart, or an article you want to feature, or whatever, basically. It's a very common use case, and CSS variables make it really easy. And throughout this course, you'll become a CSS variables master in 8 screencasts. They're pretty quick. I explain my goal with this course is to get you up to speed as quickly as possible. There are also some interactive challenges, or I will at least challenge you to jump into the code and perform tasks in some of the casts. And there's a Q&A section in each of the casts, so feel free to ask questions there, and I will try to reply as best as I can, or sometimes other people actually also reply. And that's great. If you see a question and you know the answer, feel free to help other people out, as that's great for your karma. Finally, this is me. I'm a front-end developer and a co-founder of this site, Scrimba. You can reach out to me via Twitter if you want, or feel free to join our Gitter chat room if you have any comments or questions. So, finally, this is the project we'll be working on throughout this course, so you'll get very familiar with this. Here is the markup, and in the index.css, the CSS which we'll be working with. And in the next screencast, you'll create your very first CSS variable, so I'll see you there. Hey, in this screencast, you're going to learn how to create your very first CSS variable. So here we have an example of a portfolio website. It consists of a navbar, a main section with some items, and then a footer. And this is what we'll be working with throughout this course. The CSS is defined here, or at least the CSS that we care about. I've also added a bunch of styling in the basic.css file, but that styling won't be relevant for what you're going to learn in this course. So I've extracted out the CSS we want to work with just to make it easier for us. The markup is defined here in the index.html, and that's just straightforward HTML, which I'm not going to explain, as I'm assuming that you are familiar with HTML. So, as you can see, we have 3 different colors on our portfolio website. It's the red, which is our default text color, the beige background, and the yellow color for the items here. And as you can see from the CSS, we're reusing the hexadecimal values to quite a few places. We're setting the main red color here, and we're also setting it explicitly on the paragraph and h1 tag. And I'll tell you why a bit later in the course. And also on the anchor tags and the background of the button. And whenever you see a CSS value being reused like this, it's a perfect example for introducing CSS variables. So let's do that. We'll start by defining our variable, and then we first have to decide which scope we want the variable to live in. We'll choose the root, which is a pseudo-class that points to the root element in the document. In our case, that is the HTML element itself. And when we defined it on the top level element like that, the variables we declare inside here will be available throughout the entire app. It'll be a so-called global variable. To define it, we'll do --red, and then simply copy this value here, like that. We can now use this variable through this weird syntax var, then --red. And this might seem a little bit strange with the two dashes and the var, and then passing in the variable, but that's just how the spec is written, so you have to do it like this. Two dashes when you declare a variable and use it, and always use var, otherwise it won't work. So let's reuse this in all the other places where we're using the red color. Here, here, and down here. So now let's do the same thing with the beige background, even though that's now just being used one place here, though I still think we should put it in a variable, as it also makes the code easier to read. So let's do --beige, and copy this value, paste it in here, and then replace this with var --beige. So I think we start to see the benefit here already. We don't have to repeat ourselves again and again, and the code here is actually more understandable than if we were simply using the hexadecimal values, as this here, as the variable names allows you to quickly glance over the code and understand, okay, yeah, so the color of the h1 and the p tags is indeed red. And then there's also the obvious benefit that if we want to change a value, for example, adjust our red color a little bit, then we can simply change the value of the red variable. I happen to have a different shade of red on my clipboard, so I'll paste that in. And as you can see, that updated the red color throughout the entire app. So let's get back to the old one, like that. Okay, what I want you to do now is to take our third color, the yellow color, which is used here, and create a variable. Do it on the root element, and then use it down here. So pause the screencast, jump into the code, and do that. And when you're finished, just resume back to this screencast, and then I'll do it as well. So go ahead and do that now, as I think it's really important for you to actually get your hands dirty with the code. Okay, hopefully you managed to do the task. Now I'm going to do it. So we'll create a yellow variable, and we'll grab the color value here, and then we can replace this value here with var --yellow, and we can do the exact same thing down here. And okay, so that was it. I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, this is Per from Scrimba. I just want to let you know that we've just launched the Frontend Developer Career Path, which is a massive learning resource that'll turn you into a professional, hireable front-end developer. You'll learn everything you need to know. So that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, of course. And then you'll continue with React.js, as that's the best library to learn today in order to maximize your job chances. And then finally, we are going to go through hiring strategies and prepare you for that critical job interview. So this is our most massive learning resource ever. 75 hours of content, literally hundreds of coding challenges, so that we are 100% sure that you actually understand all the concepts you need to understand in order to become a hireable front-end developer. And of course, dozens of real-world projects. So just click this image right here and you'll be taken to the front-end developer career path. And there you can subscribe and enroll and take your first step towards getting that dream job and securing your future career as a developer. Hey, in this screencast, you're going to learn how to override variables. Because in the previous one, you learned how to create variables on the root element, which points to the root element in our document, which is this HTML tag here. And CSS variables works so that all the children of the element in which you declare the variable on have access to that variable. And as our entire markup on the page is a descendant of the HTML tag, our CSS variables were available throughout the entire application. However, There might be cases where you, for example, want the variables to change a little bit in certain sections of the app. And that's where overriding comes in, which is really handy and not something you can do with Sass and less variables, as they know nothing of the DOM, whereas CSS variable does. So you can tell a CSS variable that you want the value to change, for example, inside a given element. And we're going to do that in the items, because here we want our red color to be a little bit softer. And I've actually added the new value down here, so I'm going to copy that. And inside of the item, we'll do the exact same thing as we did up in the root. We'll simply do --red, and we'll paste in this value. And now you can see that the red color inside the items changed. And what's happening here is that the h1 tag, which is using the red variable, and the button, which is also using the red variable for its background, now has a red variable which refers to the updated value, since they are inside of the item. Let's have a look at that in the HTML. Here is the item elements. You can see it has an h1 wrapped inside of it and a button as well. And inside of each of these items, we've flipped the red variable from this value up here to this value down here. And the red variable is inherited down to its children. So all the elements inside of the items get their red variables updated as well. That's a really neat thing, that the variables are inherited down in the document tree. Notice though that for the h1 tag up here, which as we can see is outside of the divs with the class of item, the red value is still the original one up here. Okay, so that was it. I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, in this screencast, we're going to do almost the same thing as we did in the previous one, where we overrode variable in a local scope. However, this time we're going to create a new variable in a local scope. And this is relevant for cases where you know that the variable will only be used in that section of the app. So it's no need putting it in the global scope here up in the root. Let's, for example, say that we want the red color in our navbar to have a different shade than it has throughout the app. What we then can do is that on the navbar, let's target it, navbar, simply create a new variable, just as we do it in the root, by doing --. Let's call it navred. And then let's paste this value in actually, and just change it a little bit. I'm going to remove this 6 and add a 1. That should make it a bit different, though still pretty red. And then down in the anchor tags in the navbar, where we previously referred to the global red variable, we're now going to refer to the navred. And there, as you can see, the color changed to a more red-orange-ish color. And now this navred is only available in the navbar, which is the markup here, meaning that only the children inside this element can access the navred variable. So if I now try to use this navred variable outside of the navbar, let's for example try down in the button, make the background use the navred, you can see that just broke the layout because navred doesn't exist down here. It only exists inside here. So what I want you to do now is create a local variable inside of the item. You can, for example, call it item yellow, and then use that yellow inside of the items. So go ahead and do that. Pause the screencast, create a new variable in the item, and then use that variable somehow inside of the items. Okay, so hopefully you managed to do that. Now I'll show you how to do it as well. It's really simple. Simply do --, item yellow, then set the value to this here, but let's modify it a little bit. Let's swap out this C with an F. That should change it substantially. And now we'll use the item yellow here. Copy this and paste it in, and boom, you can see the yellow color inside here is updated. However, inside of the button, we're still referring to the global yellow. So let's paste that one in there as well. And there it's starting to look good or ugly, depending on your design preferences. And finally, I'm going to point out that some people prefer to separate the declaration of variables and the reference. So what you could do then is take this one and remove it, and then do item, and then paste it in there. So now we're declaring it here and referencing it down here. And that's basically a matter of personal preferences, as you can do whatever you want. Okay, that was it. So I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, in this screencast, we're going to talk about themes, because that's an area where CSS variables come in really handy. And you might think, well, I'm not going to allow my users to switch themes on my site anyway, so why do I need to learn this? Well, I'm not just talking about user-specific themes, but also component-specific themes. And that's a much more normal use case. For example, could be that you want to mark an item in your e-commerce store as purchased or added to cart. Or it could be that you have a section of your site, maybe an admin section, which has a different theme. Perhaps it's darker than the website itself. Or as we are going to do, perhaps you want to feature something on your site. And by simply giving the item a featured class, make it stand out from the rest. So that's what we're going to do here now. We want to simply be able to add a featured class to one of these items and thereby make it stand out from the rest. We basically want to be able to do like this featured, which should result in a style change for both the div here itself and the h1 and button. And normally, in order to do this, you'd have to create a featured class and then also target the button and also the h1 tag. It would result in quite a lot of extra CSS in order to achieve that. But the beautiful thing with CSS variables is that you can scrap all of this, and inside of this featured class here, we're simply going to change the value of a few variables. We're going to override them, which we learned in the previous screencast. I've cheated a little bit and copied in the new values for yellow and red in here, and simply paste that in, and boom, as you can see, now this project D item stands out from the other items. It's not a particularly nice color, but it proves the point. So what happens here is that the H1, which is inside of featured, now refers to the red value, which we have declared here, and not the red value we declared up here. And also the button, it's red and yellow, now refer to the local values for red and yellow. Now we can add featured to this item here as well, for example, run the code, and here you can see now both of these are featured. So technically, we're just doing the same thing that we did in the screencast where we were overriding variables. However, now we've put it in a more useful context. Okay, that was it. I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, in this screencast, we're going to learn how to work with CSS variables in JavaScript. Because as I've mentioned before, CSS variables live in the DOM, meaning that you can update them with JavaScript. That's super cool, not something you could do with, for example, Sass or less variables, as they are transpiled down to regular CSS. So let's head over to the index.js. And the first thing we need to do is to grab hold of the root, which is where we declared the variables. You can see here, and that now refers to the HTML, as that is the root of our document. So we'll do var root equals document dot query selector, and then grab the root. Let's log that out. As you can see, that logs out the HTML element itself. To get the styles we've defined on root, we'll do var root styles, and then use the get computed style method, which we have access to, and which returns the properties and values for the element we pass in. And we'll pass in the root. And then to get one of the variables, let's for example grab the red one. We'll do root styles dot get property value, and then simply pass in the name of the variable, which is red. Now console log out red. You'll see that we get the correct value. You can see this one here. So now that we know that we can fetch the variable, let's also change it. To do that, we'll refer to the root again. Do root style set property. And then the first parameter is the name of the variable, which is --red. And the second one is whatever we want to update it to. So let's just change it for the sake of this tutorial to green. Run the code and boom, as you can see, the entire page has been updated as we've simply changed this here, and it's inherited down to all the elements which is using it throughout this app. So this is super useful. Just imagine that you, for example, want your users to change the font size on the page, or maybe you actually want them to be able to pick themes or change colors in some sections. CSS variables make that really easy for you. Okay, what I want you to do now is to fetch this yellow color here, which we are using in the background for the items. Fetch it out using JavaScript and change it to something else, for example, to orange. So go ahead and do that. And when you come back, I'll do it as well. Okay, hopefully you managed to do the task. It's really simple. All you have to do is, in order to fetch this yellow color here, is simply change the red to yellow instead. Let's also change the other references to yellow like that. And then let's set it to orange. And there we go. We've changed the yellow variable to orange, and that affects not only the background of the items themselves, as it uses the yellow variable, but also the text color inside of the button. And both of them are now orange. Okay, that was it. I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, in this screencast, I'm going to teach you how to change a variable based upon the width of the screen. Because shrink the screen down to a typical mobile width, the items become too wide for the screen. So we need to rearrange on our grid. We want them to rather appear on top of each other, so stacked downwards. And to do that, you have to learn a little bit about CSS grid as well, because I've pulled in the grid styling, which is the styling for the grid. And I actually have a full CSS grid course, which I've linked to in the About section in this screencast, so be sure to check that one out as well. And if you haven't seen CSS grid before, it's pretty straightforward, but what we're saying here is that our element with the class of grid, which is the grid here, which wraps these 4 items. Let's do like this. So this one here is getting a display of grid, and we're defining the columns here. We're saying that we want 2 columns, each being 200 pixels wide. So these 2 columns are 200 pixels wide each. And grid auto rows means that the rows will be 140 pixels tall. So we're setting that here. And grid gap sets the gap in between the items. And justify content center basically centers the content. So check out my grid course if you think this is hard, but you don't really need to understand this. All you need to understand is this line here, which is saying that we want 2 columns, each being 200 pixels wide, because that's what we need to change with our media query, meaning that we need to extract this out in a variable. And I actually like to declare my variables at the top. So have it like this. Variable declarations, and then have the styled here so that we separate the 2. And here we'll do grid and paste in grid template columns, but we'll change this to columns. And then when we're using that value, we just have to do var -- columns like that. So this should be pretty straightforward for you by now. We're declaring a variable and we're using it. Now let's change it when the width of the screen becomes less than 450 pixels. Media, all, and max width of 450px. And you might be fooled to think that you could just do like this, columns 200px, as that's the change we want. We want to remove one of the columns. Here we have 2 columns, each being 200 pixels. You want to reduce that to 1, which basically results in the items stacking on top of each other. However, we can't just change it here. We have to wrap it in the scope in which we defined it. The grid, like that. Here. So at the width, which is below 450px, we're going to change the columns variable inside of grid to 200px instead of 200px, 200px. Let's try that. We'll narrow the screen, and boom, as you can see, now they're stacked on top of each other. And this isn't something that you could have done with less or Sass variables, as they have no information of what's going on in the DOM. They're already transpiled down to regular CSS. However, as these CSS variables live in the DOM, they have access to this, and you can change them based upon, for example, screen resize or screen size in general. Now what I want you to do is also change the background, the beige color, when the screen is less than 450px. So jump into the code and try to do that. And when you come back, I'll show you how to do it as well. Okay, so hopefully you managed to do the task, changing the beige color. And to do that, you have to refer to the root again and do beige, and then give it a new value. Let's copy this and paste it in and change it a little bit. Run the code. And then when we shrink on the page, boom, you can see that the background also changed. Okay, that was it. I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey, in this screencast, I want to talk a little bit about inheritance. As you've seen throughout this course, CSS variables behave very much as other CSS properties in that their values are inherited and cascade. However, there are a few things that you maybe would think that would work, but which doesn't. And I want to explain those two in this screencast. Now, the first one is that you can create variables based upon other variables. Let's say that we, for example, call one variable main color, and we want it to simply be the red color. Now we can refer to main color instead of red, for example, down here in the anchor tags in the navbar. Let's do that. They are still red now. And here you might be fooled to think that you could actually do like this and update the red or override the red variable here to something else. Let's just change it to orange instead, for example. And you could expect that that would override the red, which again would override main color. But as you can see, that isn't happening because main color, the value of that has already been resolved to the value of red. So main color doesn't have a reference to the variable. It only points to the value. However, if you were to rather update the main color here, like that, as you can see, then it works. So that's something you should be aware of. And the second thing is that we've here set the color of the H1s and the paragraphs to red specifically. And you don't actually need this. We could have just taken this away and the page would look identical. However, if you now were to, for example, update the red value here to, let's do orange here as well, then you can see that the H1 isn't updated. And that's because it has inherited the H1, the color red, from the body, though it has only inherited the value of the variable. It doesn't inherit the variable itself. So again, it's this about referencing the value or the variable. And we have to explicitly tell it to reference the variable in order to be able to then change the H1 tag with this overriding here. Now you can see it is indeed orange. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. If it was, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A section, and I'll reply as soon as I can.
Hello everyone, it's Leanne from Scrimba here, and I just want to say that you officially rock. Well done for completing Learn CSS Variables for free. You might be wondering what to do now. Well, we think you should get some more practice building real-world apps and reach a professional level in CSS and responsive design. And we've got the perfect course to help you do that, the Responsive Web Design Bootcamp. It's full of real-world projects such as this barbecue page, this marketing page, and this blog, and it'll teach you everything you need to know to make sure your sites look awesome across all devices. Topics include CSS basics, text and fonts, flexbox, design best practices, grid, transitions, units and responsive text, vertical alignment, media queries, and more. And it's taught by Kevin Powell. He's a CSS evangelist and hugely popular Scrimba teacher, and he loves teaching people how to make the web and how to make it look good while they're at it. So if you want your sites to look great, check out the Responsive Web Design Bootcamp today. Good luck and happy coding!